Hello and welcome. My name is Chris Coffin. I am Senior Policy Advisor for American Farmland Trust, and I direct our National Agricultural Land Network. We are delighted that so many of you have joined us today for our Buy, Protect, Sell 201 webinar. We had a terrific Buy, Protect, Sell 101 webinar in December. If you missed it, you can find a link for that recording on our Farmland Information Center website, and that link is at farmlandinfo.org. We are grateful to our terrific slate of panelists for making the time to share their expertise and experiences with us today. Most of them, you will notice, are repeats that have come back from our first webinar. Bios for each of them can be found in the handouts section of the control panel. Before we get started, let me go through a few quick housekeeping logistics to make this a good experience. You were all muted, so there's no need to mute yourself. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can do so by going to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a little orange arrow at the top that allows the panel to shrink and reopen. You'll see a questions section of that control panel. You can pop that section out by clicking on the little square. That decouples it from the control panel, and once you do that, you can write your questions and comments in there. And we have designed this so that we will have plenty of time for comments. We're recording the webinar and we'll send the link of the recording to everyone who is registered. Please feel free to share that recording with others. We would like to, as we did the first go round, get a quick indication of people's level of experience with Buy, Protect, Sell. So we are going to quickly put up a poll. If you are having difficulty voting in the poll, it may be that you are in full screen mode. So you have to toggle out of that and you should be able to participate. Okay, this is great. This is terrific that we have a good diversity of folks here, especially the thinking about taking on Buy, Protect, Sell projects. So we hope that this will get you one step closer to doing that. So today, we are focusing particularly on the different ways that Buy, Protect, Sell projects can be configured. And so to give us an overview of that, we're going to start with a video featuring American Farmland Trust's President and CEO, John Piatti. As some of you remember from the first webinar, John was formerly president of Maine Farmland Trust, and while there started MFT down its now long path and successful path of doing Buy, Protect, Sell projects. This is about a 7-minute video. Again, John is going to give an overview of configurations. John will join us after the video for a few additional comments. If people have questions for John, please stick them into the chat box and the question box, and we will ask them of John. And then we are going to turn it over to our terrific panelists. After we begin the video, if you have any trouble viewing it or hearing it, go to the top of your dashboard. To the right of the words File, View, Help, there are screen view choices. View in full screen or view in window mode. Toggle between the two to find the best results. Note that during the first 4 to 5 seconds, there is not audio. And if anybody has questions, again, or having trouble, write that into your question box and we'll see if we can troubleshoot for you. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and start the video.
I'm John Piatti, the president of American Farmland Trust, and I'm delighted to be with you today to have the second conversation about BPS, Buy, Protect, Sell. Now, in the first session, I talked about some of my experiences when I was at Maine Farmland Trust. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the variations that we see in BPS projects and a little bit about how that relates to changes in the 2018 Farm Bill. And then after me, there's going to be a panel who's going to walk through individual projects and help you understand this a little bit better. So, buy, protect, sell. I've got my fancy visual here. Buy, protect, sell, as the name implies. It is about purchasing property and then protecting it with an agricultural conservation easement, and then turning around and reselling the property to a farmer at a more affordable cost. But rather than buy a property, sometimes you're fortunate and a property will get gifted to an organization. That's happened to us at Maine Farmland Trust. It's happened to us at American Farmland Trust. And then there's an option that's something in between those two, right? Sometimes you can get a bargain sale. Sometimes a farmer is willing to sell a farm property to you at a more affordable price below market value because the farmer is excited about seeing that property permanently preserved. And I want to stress that because, as I mentioned in my first presentation, making BPS projects work is all about making the numbers work. And to the extent that you can start at a lower cost, it makes things an awful lot easier. And I posit that there's a lot of landowners who are willing to sell farm properties at slightly below market value. So as you're thinking about your program, definitely make sure you think about bargain sales proactively for the front end and how you can work those into the mix. So it's not just buying, might be a gift, might be a bargain sale. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's also some options, right? Some different alternatives. Rather than selling it, you may end up leasing the property with the idea of ultimately selling it. Maybe it's a farmer who's not yet in a financial position to buy the property. Maybe he's waiting for an FSA loan or something like that. Or you may even consider a situation where you're holding the property long term and planning on leasing it over time. This may be a needed strategy if it's a property that even with an easement on it will never be affordable enough for an incoming farmer. So maybe you create a long-term lease opportunity. So as I pointed out, a number of variations. I'm going to add yet another twist, and that's at the front end up here. Maybe rather than buy the property, maybe you get an option to purchase the property. And that can have great value because you may be able to line up the purchasing farmer in advance of actually purchasing the property. And in an ideal situation, you may be able to transfer that option to the purchasing farmer and never actually own the property yourself as a land trust, reducing your risk and reducing your costs. So, it can be a little complicated. I'm going to complicate it a little bit more because I talked about buy, protect, sell, but in truth, many of these deals work a little differently. We buy them and then we sell them, and simultaneously or soon thereafter, we then protect the farm property. And there's reasons to do it in this direction. One reason is it keeps open your option on what's going to be in that easement until you've identified the farmer. And you can define the easement better for the incoming farmer's needs. The second reason is that until recently, this was really the only way that you could take advantage of federal funding for easement acquisitions. The funds always had to flow to the property owner. Now, that's one of the things that the current Farm Bill has changed, and we're going to talk about that now. We all know that the 2018 Farm Bill provided more money to ASAP. Great news. The 18 Farm Bill also created an opportunity where ASAP funds could be used for BPS projects. We could always in the past use ASAP funds at this point, but now we can use ASAP funds to cover a more classic BPS project. And here's how it will work. A land trust can apply for funds up front and receive easement funding that will help pay for the purchase of a property. And that land trust will then have 3 years to find a buyer for that property and can ask for a 1-year extension from the secretary if needed. But there is a complication. The federal government and most states do not allow a single entity to both hold land and fee and hold the easement on it. So what that means is there has to be another system to make this all work. One option is that the land trust can ask another entity to hold the easement, perhaps temporarily, and that's an approach that works fine. Alternatively, the land trust can plan to hold the easement from the beginning, but have another party, a third party, stand in as the buyer of that property. So I'm going to use another one of my fancy visuals here to explain this. So if you're using ACEP funds, BPS projects can work in this manner. Either the land trust can be the buyer, and then the land trust can protect it by working with another entity, a third party who will hold the easement, and then ultimately it flows to the farmer. The other approach that works is the land trust that's driving the project can find a third party to be the buyer, and then the land trust, at the time of the easement is placed on the property, the land trust would become the holder, and then ultimately the land would transfer to the farmer. Either work. In this situation, the third party would be here temporarily until the property is transferred to the farmer. In this situation, the third party could be a permanent holder of that easement, or that holding entity could assign the easement back to the land trust after the property is conveyed. It's confusing. It's a little confusing, but it's worth it. And the reason is, as I explained in my first presentation, these are very valuable projects. They provide a new tool to the farmland protection toolbox that can do things that other easement projects simply can't do. So even though it's complicated, it's worth getting to know and understanding what's possible. And American Farmland Trust is here to help land trusts, to help public programs that need more information on buy, protect, sell, learn what you need to do so you can execute these projects. Thanks for your time.
That was terrific. Thank you, John. I especially love the visuals. So how about, I know that you had a few more comments that you wanted to say at the end of the video, so.
Well, very simply, after I made the video yesterday morning, I realized that someone looking at it for the first time, maybe someone with not a lot of knowledge about buy, protect, sell projects, their head may have been swimming. This seems so complicated. It doesn't have to be that complicated. We're diving a little deeper here in this presentation. We're presenting some of those complexities. But the message I really wanted to deliver is the best way to understand these projects is to go through individual projects and look at how they materialize from beginning to end. And that's a great part of what's coming up with the panel presentation. So my principal extra comment was to say, if I confused you, don't worry. But I am available for a few questions if there are any, Chris. I don't know if there are.
Yes, well, we have one, and if there are others who have questions, please feel free to write them in now, and otherwise John will be with us for the whole webinar. So if you think of things afterwards, feel free to write them in then. Here's a question for you, John. Many NGO and government organizations are interested in the buy, protect, sell model to lease or sell outright. Protected lands for new and beginning farmers and socially disadvantaged farmers. Some organizations have expressed concern over government agencies retaining or owning land, even for the purpose of providing greater access to disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. What would you say to those entities that express hesitation in government ownership of lands for this express purpose?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I have two answers. First is, I do think the best strategy whenever possible is to get land ultimately to be owned by a private individual. I don't think long-term holding by a land trust or a government entity is the best strategy. It's sometimes necessary. I'll mention that in a moment. But the best strategy is to get it in the hands of a farmer. And that means, well, I should say, the barrier to that is when you can't get the cost low enough to make it actually affordable. And that is sometimes something you can address with your easement provisions. As we all know, ag easements come in all shapes and sizes. And the more restrictions or the more additional layers that you put in it, the more valuable that easement is, which means the underlying cost once the easement's placed on it will be lower. So one strategy to make sure that property ends up in the hands of a farmer at the most affordable price possible is think about additions to a classic easement. It might be an affirmative farming covenant. It might be some kind of an affordability covenant. That could be an option to purchase at agricultural value. There are a number of things you can do that might get that cost to the buying farmer down as low as possible. So that's one answer. It's try not to hold the property. But there may be instances in certain locations and places where it really is the only viable strategy. There's no way you can make the land affordable for farmers without long-term holding. And I think my response there is that the entity simply just needs to make that clear, to state that, right? We are in the business of trying to make it possible for beginning farmers or disadvantaged farmers to enter the field. And in this location, given price costs and development trends and the like, that is impossible in any other way except long-term holding. So I think that's the answer, is there are some situations where if the goal is land access, you do need to think about that strategy.
Okay, great. That is very helpful. I think in the interest of time, we're going to move on and introduce our panelists. Thank you. Stay with us. So let's start in. I'm going to quickly introduce all the members of the panel. Well, you know what? Maybe I won't. I think maybe I'm not. I'm going to do it this way since Susan's is up here on the screen. We're just going to do this one by one. So our first presenter here is Susan Payne, who is Executive Director with the New Jersey State Agriculture Development Committee. And let me just touch on for a moment what we have asked each of our panelists to do here is to talk about how they have configured a particular project, and that might be one that they are in the midst of, or it might be one that has been completed. We've asked them to take no more than 10 minutes, and if they come in under the 10 minutes, we'll have time for questions right then and there. We do have time built in at the back end for questions, so feel free to be writing your questions into the question box as our presenters are going through. So Susan, to you, and let me say, Susan here is the one representative of the public sector here. The state of New Jersey has done buy, protect, sell projects, so we are particularly delighted to have this an example of how a state agency has thought about this type of program and project. So thank you, Susan, for joining us.
You're welcome. So good afternoon, everybody, and we'll just jump right into it. So let's go to the first slide. So my agency runs the Farmland Preservation Program for the state of New Jersey, and we have done buy, protect, sell projects ourselves where we've acquired land from farmers and and held it and sold it to a new farmer subject to an easement. But what we do mostly now is we work with nonprofits or local governments who are trying to do buy, protect, sell, and we are a funding source. And so that's really what I wanted to talk to you about today and give you an example, which I think is pretty straightforward and relatively simple to give you an idea of what are the basics? And so let's start this recent transaction, well, recent in the last 10 years, is the Payne estate in Sussex County, New Jersey. And so this was a very historic farm held by the same family since the late 1800s, about 120 acres, and it was really valued for its viewshed protection value by the local land trust. So the agency we're talking about here, the land trust, is the Land Conservancy of New Jersey. Go to the next slide. So in terms of timing, I mean, I think the two big questions in buy protect sells are how do you figure out the timing and how do you figure out the money, right? So just in a very straightforward process to give you a sense of timing as an example, the land trust made application to the SADC in 2007. The following year, we approved that application and gave them a $500,000 grant for fee simple acquisition of the property. And so this is an important distinction. I don't know how many other states do fee simple grants as opposed to a grant just on the purchase of the easement. So that's a unique aspect about our program, and I think it really helps land trusts as a result. Generally, our nonprofit program, we always provide 50%. So it's either 50% of fee simple or it's 50% of the easement purchase. So the land trust then asked whether the SADC would be willing to use some of its own federal AIL money and pass that through to make this transaction work. So we did. We agreed to utilize AIL funds we had qualified for to apply to this project to make it more affordable. I think it's important to note here that if you look at the timing, at the end of 2008, of course, the Great Recession hit, and the real estate market kind of crashed along with the stock market. So TLC&J had appraised the property, before all of that happened, and that kind of comes into some of the timing of this transaction. So in any case, the appraisals were done, and once that value was understood and that they determined that we would pass through federal funds, then in 2009, they secured additional participation from both the county that the property is located in and the township. So they were building all of their partners to try to come in and make the deal together. So ultimately, the land was acquired in 2010 and preserved, and then the land trust held on to it for 10 years and just sold it very recently. And that kind of got to the timing with respect to the appraisals and the acquisition were kind of done at the height of the real estate market, right? And so then they acquired it. In the meantime, things had really decreased. And so the nonprofit made the conscious decision to hold on to the property much longer than they had originally intended to try to see whether the real estate market would recover and that they could get more of their investment back. And so during the interim, they did things like obviously leased the land to a farmer. They leased it for grazing rights. They entered into leases with hunting clubs, right? They tried all of these different ways to try to raise enough funds while they were holding the property to offset their holding costs. Next slide. So here's in a nutshell what the funding looked like. So they purchased the property a little under $1 million at $990,000, and the same day conveyed the easement to the SADC. We provided our $500,000 grant, again in a form of a fee simple grant. The AIL funds that were used represented a 50% of the easement value, right? Because I don't think even till today, including today, the federal government provides cost share on fee simple cost. They only provide cost share on the easement value. So you can see based on these numbers, right, the fee simple value of the property was basically double, what the easement value was. So, and then Sussex County provided the balance that was needed also in the form of a fee simple grant. And so what I wanted to note here is fee simple, you get a fee simple grant at the beginning of a transaction in New Jersey. Well, then when you sell the property as a nonprofit or a local government, then the state needs to be reimbursed its share of those proceeds, right? Because what we're doing is we're helping you buy the easement at the end of the day. But how we're doing that is we're providing you help buying the fee, but then when you sell it, we get a share, our proportionate share of the proceeds back. So this is a really effective way of helping nonprofits reduce those upfront costs of fee simple acquisition, and I think that makes this really unique. Next slide. So they were able to acquire the property with basically all government funds, right? All 3 government partners plus the federal government covered those purchase costs. So then when it came time to sell the property, they sold the property for $375,000. When you deducted some of their direct costs, such as a recent appraisal that they had to do to figure out, how much was the preserved farm worth, that was $5,000, that and realty transfer fees. So how we do it in New Jersey is we say, how much did you sell the property for? And then deduct certain costs, that $5,000. And the net of that is what we consider the net proceeds. And then we apply the reimbursement to that net proceeds number. So they reimbursed us 50% because that's how much our grant was going in, and they reimbursed the county 22%. And so you can see those prices. 185 came back to the state, 82,000 went back to the county. But at the end of the day, the nonprofit came out ahead, to the tune of about $100,000. And in speaking with the nonprofit, that real net is probably closer to like 80,000 when you look at costs that they had, like legal fees and real estate fees, commission fees. And I actually asked them, why did you use a realtor? Like, couldn't you have done this yourself and saved on a real estate commission? And I thought one of the really important things they said was, in order to maintain their land trust accreditation through the Land Trust Alliance, they have to be very careful to demonstrate that they were 100% transparent, that they did a really good job at marketing this farm, and that the buyer in the end, that it wasn't some kind of inside sweet deal, right? Because the integrity of that closing transaction is really key to the land trust maintaining its accreditation. So in the end, they went through all of that. They went through a realtor and advertising and all and the like, and they did wind up selling it to the farmer who was renting it and who also happened to own the property next door. But the process of them being really transparent and well advertised and exposing it to the real estate market was really important to them. So I thought that was an interesting point. I have about a minute left. I think the only thing I'd say is that if you're working with a state agency and you want state funding towards a buy, protect, sale deal or an easement deal for that matter, you really need to make sure you understand the rules and statutes surrounding the state programs. Every state program has its own wrinkles, and you don't want to have spent a lot of money and a lot of time on a transaction only to find out, late in the game that there was some regulation that prevents the state from participating or limits the state's participation. So I would encourage you to develop good communication and relationships with your state funding partners to make sure that they're right with you, as you're stepping through the transaction. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Susan. That was very insightful. I think we are going to move on. We don't have any questions for you right now. I suspect there will be. So folks, again, please feel free to write things in. I do want to clarify one thing. You referred to ALE, but I'm assuming since it was 2008, it was FRPP money you were, right?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. So let's go on. I'm going to introduce our next panelist, and that's Christian Varsa, who is the Working Farms Fund Associate with the Conservation Fund. Again, everyone's bio, more information on each of our panelists is in the handout section. But thank you, Christian. Take it away.
Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate it. Those of you who were on the 101 can just swap me out for Stacy, who is here. So I'm standing in for Stacy Funderburk, representing the Conservation Fund, to talk a little bit about the Working Farms Fund and to talk, a little more in depth. What was kind of discussed about my section was that I was going to try to unpack some of the fundraising elements of Buy, Protect, Sell, and so I'm going to try to do a little bit of that and then tie that into our first project, which I am very, very happy to tell you actually closed just yesterday. So, the Working Farms Fund is a newer program that the Conservation Fund is doing in the Atlanta metro area, and the fact that we managed to have our first closing yesterday is a huge, huge win for us. So we're really excited. There we go. Thank you. And we can just go into the first slide, please. So what I did want to kind of cover in depth and try to tease out a little bit is this question about accessing capital. There are a lot of models between the different entities involved here and the panelists on this call today in terms of how they go about pulling together a Buy, Protect, Sell model. I think John did a really good example talking about how, not only are there different ways to do Buy, Protect, Sell, but it's also Buy, Sell, Protect, and many different ways therein. And the way that you pull together the funding is going to change depending on your individual situation as an organization. There are kind of two broad ways you can think about accessing capital. One might be kind of grants, money that's a little less attached and lower credit requirement that might go into a revolving fund, and an impact investment or a loan capital, which might be more anchored to a particular project or needs to be repaid. And I'm just going to kind of break these down a little bit. I thought Susan's, New Jersey has some really amazing things going on, and having those individual opportunities to work at the state level with the state to provide those funds as a standalone grant is really unique. There are not a whole lot of states that are doing that. And so, I don't even have that really captured here because that is not something that we really even see a lot, definitely not in Georgia yet. So, but the first category that I wanted to cover is the idea of philanthropic grants or gifts. Typically, these are interest-free. They do not require a repayment. And the organization, the land trust, the nonprofit, the conservation fund, for example, can deploy those funds for a project that they see is appropriate to the mission of the organization. And those funds can be deployed on the project. And once the project has been sold and the funds have been revolved back into the system, those funds can then be redeployed once again into a new project, which is really what the Working Farms Fund is all about, is developing a local revolving fund in the Atlanta area and then deploying that for project after project as we go through the system. Philanthropic grants and gifts could come from many places, like individuals, foundations, businesses. Rarely are you going to find traditional grants that are willing to invest in land, which we all know is a real challenge. But I guess if you're in New Jersey, then you might be in a better position there. But so maybe a state would be fall under that category here. But more typically, a state and local agency is probably going to look at loan options as a more effective way to support their local objectives for conservation. And one important one that I just kind of want to mention and kind of bring to light here is the Clean Water State Revolving Fund is typically used pretty regularly for gray water infrastructure, but there's a lot of success around the country bringing the Clean Water State Revolving Fund into green infrastructure projects, specifically even easements. The Conservation Fund has had a lot of success with this, particularly with one really large project out in California in Mendocino, protecting a sustainable redwood area. So the Clean Water State Revolving Fund is a low interest credit opportunity that is a federal partnership between states and the federal government. And that is one that you would be using in a project specific manner. It's not a revolving fund, and it would be repaid immediately after the sale has transpired. And then, if you want to deploy additional funds for protection in the future or for purchase in the future, you'd have to reapply for those funds. So, and then there's kind of the area that we continue to explore and invest our time in a little bit more, which is an area of impact investment, which oftentimes is kind of led by individuals and businesses. Sometimes foundations, where they are providing, again, low or even no credit interest at times, loans for purchase or for accessing capital. They can be project specific, or they may be more open to the organization deciding what kind of approach that they want to take, which is kind of a nice increased flexibility. These also, however, must be repaid, and so that is important to keep in mind. Did want to mention the Conservation Fund specifically has had a lot of success using foundation PRIs. A PRI, or program-related investment, is an investment that a foundation makes because, and this is really beneficial to foundations, and maybe this is one way that you can encourage a foundation to engage, is a PRI meets their 5% requirement of divestment in any given year, and so it just means that it meets the objective of the organization or the foundation from a program perspective and a mission perspective, and it is slow money that can come back into the foundation with interest as well. So definitely look into PRIs. And then I wanted to also go into, just because we are very excited about closing on it yesterday and want to kind of tie this directly into a particular project. Maybe you go to the next slide, and I will talk about the first acquisition we're doing, which is this Love is Love Farm. This is a cooperative of 5 farmers from the Atlanta area. And the funding for this project is a revolving fund. And so the Working Farms Fund in general will be trying to increase our capital over time in our revolving fund. We anticipate that we will definitely be looking to some low interest credit opportunities, both at an impact investment level and hopefully at a state clean water revolving fund or similar situation. But this is coming directly from philanthropic grants, where we are able to direct those funds into the purchase of the farm. And then the farmer that we identified as a good match for that site is going to immediately be leasing that land from us in a lease to own option to purchase lease. And then ideally, if everything goes according to plan, we will protect the property with a permanent conservation easement with an ASAP project with a local land trust, so that we have the long-term holder of the land trust coming in, and then on the back end selling the property at an affordable rate to the farmer. We've learned a lot in the last couple of months, and these are some things that maybe some of my colleagues are already pretty attuned to, but the greatest challenge that we've seen is we're dealing with a property that's very raw. This is not a farm. This is a field, and so we are working on trying to build out the infrastructure for a brand new farm. That's going to be an interesting hurdle, as will be the existing renter that is in the home that's on the property that we're transitioning out of the property. That's an extra wrinkle that we weren't anticipating. The greatest success we're very excited about is that we're closing on our first working farms fund purchase in a very aggressive market outside of Atlanta right now, where development pressures are just dramatically increasing. Some additional hurdles that we're navigating are helping the farm team figure out their new municipality, their government programs, the partnerships in their new geography, because they're moving about 60 miles outside of Atlanta. So there's a lot of transition to support them with. And then we also have hurdles still in acquiring funding to purchase the conservation easement through an ASAP-like project. We will anticipate hopefully having RCPP or other similar funding come down the pike, but identifying local match and supporting the full purchase of the ASAP project is definitely going to be a future hurdle. And some lessons we've learned so far: obviously, we're going to ensure the renters are given notice earlier and have a longer due diligence period to help that transition. And then we also are we've been really challenged to ensure that we are season sensitive to the farmers who are dependent on ensuring that they are successful from one season to the next, and getting them on in the winter has been critical. So that's about all. I just wanted to show the map of the Working Farms Fund area. And we're going to work on putting about 2 to 5 more farmers onto different properties this year through a variety of the funding mechanisms that I talked about. And I'd be happy to answer any additional questions related to that. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Christian. I think that's particularly useful information on many of the funding sources, including the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. I think is something everyone should be keeping in mind. I think given the time, we should keep going and save questions for later, but please, everybody, feel free to be putting questions in the chat box. So I'm going to move on to our next presenter, and that's Adam Bishop, who is the Farmland Protection Program Director with Maine Farmland Trust. And I know, Adam, you've had many projects to choose from here in thinking about which one to focus on. So thank you for joining us, and look forward to this.
Okay, thank you, Chris. And you can go right to the next slide, Beth. Thank you. I was asked to talk about a project today that involved a little bit of a somewhat complicated reconfiguration. That's something that MFT has quite a bit of experience with in terms of buying a farm and perhaps configuring it into 2 farm parcels, or a farm parcel and some non-farm parcels to help with the bottom line of the project and get an affordable piece of farmland into the hands of a farmer. So this property that I'm going to talk about today was sold to some farmers that operate an organic, diversified vegetable farm in Bodenham, Maine. The original property was about 190 acres, valued at $950,000, just under $1 million, with a farmhouse on it pre-1900, I think more like 1860 or so. You can go to the next slide, Beth, please. And could you actually go to the next one, and we can come back to this one? Thank you. A little bit about the area, because it is relevant in terms of how the reconfiguration happened. The property that we're talking about here is sort of in the middle of the map there, outlined in yellow there where the cursor is. And it actually extends beyond the green, east to west, from river to river. And this is just a conservation map of this area. And the point here is that there's a lot of other conserved land in this area, a lot of other active conservation happening, both by the state of Maine and other nonprofit conservation partners. And having all that activity happening right here led to some really great opportunities for partnerships and reconfiguration of the property that I'm going to talk about. It's also, as you can see, has water frontage on a river right where it flows into a bay, and it's really some of the most fertile farmland soils in Maine, or at least in this part of Maine. Could you go back to the previous slide, Beth? So this is the farm. Originally, it was known as Maxwell Farm, and here's a little bit about how the reconfiguration happened. We knew from the very beginning at MFT that this property worth about $950,000 as an entire unit, even protected by a conservation easement, was still going to be probably unaffordable for a farmer. At least at the start of this project, we were considering a standard agricultural conservation easement that probably would have reduced the fee value by about 50%, meaning the farm would still be worth, just under $500,000. Probably not affordable for the types of farmers that are operating in this part of the country and this part of the state. So we also knew that the farmers were really interested in the farmland piece of this and not so enthusiastic about all the excess acreage of the property. So what the reconfiguration scheme that we came up with here involved what we called the woodland parcel, the western side of the property there, which was sold to the state, which owns the abutting land to the north of this farm. And then the bay parcel all the way at the northeastern corner of the property, which, while it was open land, didn't really have farmland soils and wasn't really something that the farmers were that excited about owning. Also a pretty valuable piece of property because of the water frontage and the views from that location. And that piece we sold to the local land trust operating in this part of the state, which they actually acquired from us with NACA funds or wetland mitigation conservation funding, because of the water frontage and wetland frontage on the river there that was associated with that piece of the property. So then we were left with the farm parcel there, both sides of the road. Again, still a pretty valuable piece of land. Once the other parts of the property were sold off, it was still worth about $580,000. Again, the easement reduced the value of that land by about 50%, and we ended up selling it to the farmers for about $290,000. So, at the end of the day, this property that went on the real estate market for just under $1 million, because of the reconfiguration work that we were able to do on it, we ended up with a really affordable piece of, a really affordable farm parcel for the farmers that ended up buying it from MFT. There's a few complications here. We knew that we wanted to use ASAP-ALE funding to help fund the conservation easement portion of this property's value. This is one, like John was talking about in the beginning, where this was more of a buy, sell, protect, where the ASAP funding wasn't immediately available. So our land trust sold the farm to the farmers we sold it to them unencumbered for its unencumbered value, and with an agreement in place that they would eventually sell the conservation easement. We owner financed the part of the purchase price that was the easement value, and then 2.5 years down the road, completed the ASAP-ALE transaction, and they paid off the owner financing that allowed them to acquire the property at a very affordable price. Another slight complication that happened here is halfway through the project, after we had already sold them the farm parcel, actually, the farmers decided that they did not want the house parcel to be included in the conservation easement area. But we had already sold them the farm with the understanding that the house parcel was going to be protected by conservation easement, and sold it to them for a price based on that understanding. We agreed with them that it made sense for the house parcel not to be included. This was an old house, costly house to maintain and heat, and they thought, understandably, that a future farmer may want to build something a little bit more affordable. We ended up allowing them to remove the house parcel from the area that we were going to protect with a conservation easement in exchange for putting an in exchange for including an option to purchase at agricultural value in the easement that protected the balance of the farm parcel. So reconfiguration, a little bit of complications, but ultimately a real nice piece of conservation where there's this farm that is not only affordable to the current farmers when they purchased it, but will transfer affordably from owner to owner in the future. You can go for 2 slides, Beth, please. There's the house on the property and some of the fields. This is just a word about the 3-year timeline here. MFT acquired the property. We did some of the out sales, the reconfiguration, and we finally closed on the ASAP Ale easement, which here is taking about 2 years from start to finish these days. Next slide, please. And here's what the project budget looked like. MFT, Maine Farmland Trust, did end up having to do about $225,000 worth of fundraising here to make the budget work. There's some of the resale and outsale prices that happened, and but ultimately this was a property that was for sale for over $1 million, which was purchased for $980,000, which we protected for a cost to our organization of $225,000, which was a lot less than it would have cost to buy an easement on this farm, even if there was a landowner that was interested and willing to sell an easement from the beginning of the project, which there wasn't. So the 3-year timeline did add up to some significant costs. Can you go to the next slide, please, Beth? In this case, the house was infested with a very bad mold problem, which cost quite a bit to remediate. The debt service on the conventional bank financing that we used to buy the farm, the taxes paid over a 3-year period, the ASAP Ale due diligence, and those other types of project costs. So, you know, as the longer you own a piece of property, the more the costs add up for the land trust. But in this case, it worked out really well. And next slide, please, Beth. That is it. I hope that that was interesting, and I will look forward to any questions that might come up in the Q&A period. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Adam. That is really fascinating about all of the, even when you think that you have thought of all the contingencies that you need to recognize that things come up and throw you a little bit of a curveball. Let's keep going. I think at this point we'll just get through everyone and then move into questions. So our next presenter is Maggie Donnan, who is the Farmland Access Program Manager for the Vermont Land Trust, another entity that has done a lot of buy, protect, sell projects. So take it away, Maggie.
Thanks, Chris. You can go to the next slide, Beth. Yeah, so Chris is accurate in saying we've been doing this work mainly through our Farmland Access Program for over 10 years, and I've been at VLT for about a year, so I'm fairly new to this role, but was involved in a lot of buy, protect, sell projects in my previous role as a farm business planner, and was familiar with this project that I'm going to talk about. So you can go to the next slide. So the sort of specification of this presentation is just around our process for finding farm buyers and some of the lessons learned from that process. So I'm going to be talking about a property that we acquired in 2017 called the Norris Berry Farm. That's what it was called at the time. So it's 108 acres, 94 acres of cropland, mostly statewide soils, but some prime soils as well. This was a large existing vegetable farm in the community outside of Burlington and Moncton, Vermont. So in an area with a decent amount of development pressure, a strong market. This was a farm that had been owned by this family since 1973, and they'd run a dairy farm for 20 years. And in 1996, they stopped milking cows and kind of fully transitioned over to doing vegetables, lots of berries, more diversified production. So at the time that they engaged with the Vermont Land Trust, they were at about $300,000 in sales. So it's a significant agricultural business that was run there. They were quite prominent in the community. This is a small town, but the farm was located kind of right in the center of this community. It was an excellent conservation opportunity for us, just based on the ecological resource there. There was 675 feet of unprotected river on a tributary of the Lewis Creek, an unnamed tributary. The seller, the current owner, was eager to exit, eager to retire, ready to move to Florida, and had already had a 6-lot subdivision that was permitted that would have developed most of the farmland, and really wanted to see a conservation outcome here, but her timeline for selling the farm did not align with the timeline for conserving the property. And so, we decided to step in and purchase the farm. You can go to the next slide. So this is just another picture to give you another sense of the kind of farmstead complex area there. Some high tunnels, some perennial and annual production. Very beautiful property in the Champlain Valley. You can go to the next slide. So the timeline was that, we decided to purchase this farm without knowing exactly who we were gonna find to buy it. I think we were able to identify that it was enough of a appealing agricultural resource. The fact that, the quality of the soils, the location of the farm property, the size, as well as the fact that it was an already existing agricultural business. We hear from a lot of farm seekers that, that is something that's very beneficial for them. Market opportunities are can be a challenge, and it can take a lot of time. And so being able to jump into a business that is already at this scale is really valuable. So we signed a purchase and sales agreement with the sellers in the fall of 2016, and at that same time, we submitted a pre-application to our grant funders, the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. This is for the grant to purchase the development rights, and to just make sure that this was a conservation opportunity that we were going to be able to complete. And then pretty soon, right after that, in about November of 2016, we began our request for proposal process. So this is a process that we do on not all of our farmland access projects, but on many of them, especially when we're trying to identify a farm buyer. So we summarize the farm opportunity, and then we promote it broadly. We post it on our website. We have a farm seeker list of about 500 or 600 people that we share it with, who are always eagerly awaiting the next RFP. We hold an open house or a few open houses, and then we ask for proposals that summarize the plan for production, for financing, for management, that explain the background of the person who's applying or the group that's applying. So we began that process. And then in early 2017, we selected our farm buyer. So we had about 25 folks who attended the open house that ended up in 4 formal proposals. We have an internal committee as well as an external committee that helps us to make those decisions. So we selected a farm buyer fairly quickly and submitted our full conservation funding application to our funders. And so the way that we structured it is the farm buyer that we selected was the entity that was going to sell the easement. So, and then at that same time, they began leasing the farm from the current owner. So there was a period of time where the farmers we selected were leasing the farm from the original farmer. They were very clear, the farmers that we selected in their proposal, that they needed to get on the property right away. And didn't want to have, a period of time to wait for us to purchase the farm. And, I think that was a great idea on their part. So they began leasing the farm. And then a couple months later, VLT purchased the farm and we began our lease with those buyers. And then about in August of 2018, so about a year and a few months later, we sold the farm to the incoming buyers, and at the same time they sold a conservation easement. And you can go to the next slide. So a bit more about our farm buyers. This is Stephen and Sarah Park with the sign for the original Norris Berry Farm. Their business is called Full Belly Farm, as you might have seen on the first slide. So they had about 12 years of diversified vegetable farming experience between the two of them. They were, again, very clear that they needed to move onto the property and be able to get all of the farm income starting, as early as March of 2017. And they did have some time period where they didn't pay. They had a free lease, and then they began having a low-cost lease with the Vermont Land Trust. Our sort of theory around our leases are generally covering our costs, so taxes and insurance, and then our cost of capital. They had some equity. They owned a home, so that was very helpful. This farm was going to have a relatively high purchase price for a lot of our farmland access projects, but again, you were getting a established farm business, quite a lot of land. And they also worked really closely with the Farm Viability Program and a business planner, and so that was also a big part of their success and also what interests us. They worked with the Small Business Development Center to develop their original proposal. So I think all of those things really helped us feel like they were the right fit. You can go to the next slide. So a bit more about the details. So we purchased the farm for $825,000. We had some third-party costs and associated costs, some of which is our some interest cost. We actually borrowed about $450,000 from the seller. As John spoke about in his video, the importance of, we really try to either get a bargain sale or if we can't do that, then in this case, we asked for some seller financing that would get paid back. So some of that is debt paid back to the landowner. Some of that is the debt on the fund that we borrowed from to purchase the property. And then we were able to get, the easement value from VHCB, and then we did some local fundraising, both from a town conservation fund, other just local donors in the area, some funding from a foundation, and ended up selling the farm back to them for $405,000. So that's kind of the basics of the financial transaction. You can go to the next slide. And another thing to note is the equipment was sold separately. So that's a private agreement between the previous farmer and the incoming buyer, which tends to be our kind of standard operating procedure when it comes to equipment. So some of our lessons learned, I think one of the things that we learned in this project is, even with very qualified farm buyer, Stephen and Sarah, had some equity, they had experience, they had incredible references. It's still challenging to finance a purchase, especially at that price, in such a short period of time. So they were able to do it, but I think we've learned, not just from this project, but from a number of projects, that that short-term turnaround for purchase is really challenging, which has spurred the development of a new fund that we call the Farmland Futures Fund. That is, much of it is made up of state clean water revolving funds, as has been talked about in this presentation thus far, but lower cost money that allows us to own properties and hold them for a slightly longer period of time, to have maybe given these guys, a couple of years of ownership before they had to close. There are obviously complications that come with that. There's, added questions around improvements and repairs and maintenance and all the things that come with owning a property for a longer period of time, but I think we see that as an important tool. I think it's really important to check in on the farm buyers, so monthly check-ins to make sure that they're kind of moving along smoothly, that they have their ducks in a row. We've certainly had instances of you know, we have a plan to close at this time frame with a buyer, and we kind of get close to that, and they're clearly nowhere near ready, and we have to come up with an alternative pathway. So really, you know, cultivating that relationship. I think considering the state of the infrastructure, as Adam spoke to, I don't need to elaborate on that, but you know, we have a fairly robust due diligence process. And then I think in this case, you know, they didn't really know where they might anticipate new buildings. And so the farm complex in our easement design it's like 14 acres. It's quite large to give them opportunity to, you know, continue to grow and expand and be able to build within that building envelope. And so I think just considering easement design when you're working with a new buyer. Yeah, I think that's all my, you could go on for lessons learned forever. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, I'm sure, but we need to make time for Robin. Thank you so much, Maggie, that was great. Okay, and the last panelist is Robin Fay. Robin, who was with us before as well, is the Senior Conservation Manager for the Washington Farmland Trust. So to you, Robin. And you might need to turn on your camera so we can see you. There you go. Beautiful.
Thanks, Chris. And I've been experiencing a little bit of a lag, so please flag me down if for some reason things aren't working. I might not be able to tell so well. But thank you, Chris, and thanks to everyone on the line for joining us this afternoon. I'm really happy to be back here and talking again about these projects. I'm going to talk this time a little bit more and try and get into a little bit more of the detail on one of the projects that I touched on at the first webinar last month, and that's the Reiner Farm in Snohomish County. Beth, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So this slide just gives a real kind of high-level overview of the deal structure and timing for this project. It's a 260-acre farm that we purchased in fee in March of 2018. And what I'm going to focus on today, I think, Beth, if you advance one, there may be an animation there, is the second phase, which is the habitat protection. This is one of the elements that makes this project unique. And so what I'll be trying to focus on, other than this step, the project was structured very much like some of the other buy, protect, sell projects we've talked about. And so just to give you an overview, we did purchase the property in March of 2018. We are now undertaking a process to try and sell a 100-acre portion of the property that's critical salmon habitat along the Skykomish River to the Tulalip tribes. They're the local tribe in the area. That sale was targeted for last year and was not completed. It has been delayed a little bit, so we're hoping to close on that sale of the riparian habitat to the tribes sometime in the middle of this year. After that, we'll work to put a permanent conservation easement over the remaining farmland. That's that third step, which we also hope to complete later this year. And then eventually sell the farm portion of the property with the conservation easement in place to a farmer, and that's targeted for a few years down the road, still in 2024. So again, I'm going to dive into this habitat protection phase a little bit. If you'll go to the next slide, Beth. Great. So this slide shows a map of the property overall. The 260 acres that we purchased in fee is outlined in red there. And those dark green areas of the property, both where you see our riparian habitat conservation written, but also along the southern portions of the property, those dark green areas along what's labeled as Haskell Slough are all critical salmon habitat and steelhead habitat, both along the main stem of the Skykomish. That's approximately 2 miles of shoreline along the main stem, and then those off-channel rearing habitat areas along Haskell Slough are also important in the area. So those areas combined, as I mentioned, are about 100 acres worth of forested area that's riparian habitat. As you can see from the layout, they are not, it's an odd-shaped set of areas, and it certainly doesn't follow any existing lot lines or parcel lines. So what we're in the process of doing now is working to, similar in some ways to what Adam talked through, reconfigure the property in order to essentially adjust parcel lines to allow the Tulalip tribes to purchase only that forested riparian habitat area, and leave the remainder of the property in a configuration that still allows for agricultural operation and allows the eventual farm buyer to purchase just the tillable ground without having to purchase that additional 100 or so acres of habitat area that's that they wouldn't be able to produce on, and is largely critical areas that couldn't be farmed or developed otherwise. So if you'll advance to the next slide. I'll cut to the chase and get into the challenges and lessons learned. As I mentioned in the first webinar, we're relatively new to this buy, protect, sell process, certainly compared to some of the veterans on the line here. This is only the second buy, protect, sell project we've taken on. And early in the process, a local elected told me, we just need to get the bucket over the porcupine with this project, and then figure some of these steps out on the back end. And so that's essentially what we've done. There were a lot of local and state agencies that were really interested in seeing this property conserved. A lot of funding agencies that were interested in funding various portions of the conservation on this property, but not a single entity that was had the funding and or the mandate to tackle both the farm and riparian habitat conservation pieces of the project. So we essentially approached this project as a buy, protect, sell in order to take that role and secure the property when it was on the market for sale, and are now kind of working through all those steps on the back end. The added habitat conservation has it's added some complexity. It also adds to the value of the project tremendously. As I mentioned, with 100 acres of the total property being critical habitat, it's a really significant win for the salmon restoration community. So it's part of what makes this project worth doing and successful, but it has added some complexity. It certainly extended our timing. And it's also meant additional funders are involved. We have, of course, had to secure our funding to do the initial fee purchase. We have 2 different funders that will fund the farmland conservation easement. And then we have 3 or even 4 public funding agencies involved in the Tulalip tribe's purchase of the riparian area. So it definitely complicates that picture. It's also created a certain amount of uncertainty in negotiating what the terms of the agricultural easement will be with the prospective buyer. We can't really know exactly how to write that easement, and certainly can't know exactly what the protected property will look like under the easement until we finish that reconfiguration and know how that what that remaining farm area will look like after the riparian habitat's been purchased. So it's also delayed the easement process a little bit. And then these last 2 points I'll touch on briefly are just in doing the reconfiguration, at least from our experience, and I know this is probably something that varies a lot from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but navigating county code designed for development projects and really not designed to address a complex conservation transaction have really presented a certain number of challenges for us in Washington. That looks like doing a boundary line adjustment process to essentially enable the Tulalip tribes to purchase just the portion that they're interested in. And on a property like this, a historic farm property with a long sort of history of different ownerships, it's 16 tax parcels and 24 underlying legal lots. And so it's been a really a challenging boundary line adjustment process to go through. We're in that process now with our surveyor preparing the boundary line adjustment application as we speak, and we hope to, as I mentioned, be wrapping that piece of the project up in just a few months later this year. And I think that's probably where I'll stop for now. If you want to go to the last slide.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm happy to answer any questions, and my contact info is there also for follow-up. And this photo is just that taken looking upriver on the Skycomish there, so it gives you a little sense of the riparian area.
Yeah, that's beautiful. What a beautiful spot. Thank you so much, and thank you for letting everybody know how to reach you. So I suspect you will hear from people, so thank you for that. We have a couple of questions, and this first one is to any of you. These project examples make me think that the 3-year timeline imposed by the 2018 Farm Bill, so for ASEP AL projects, is not very attainable, wondering what the panelists think about that. And I should say that it's 3 years. As John said, it is 3 years plus 1 if you can make the case for that extension. But feel free, and why don't all of you, all of our panelists, come back on, turn your webcams back on, and anybody want to take a shot at answering that or opining on that?
I'll just offer that we've had to request extensions numerous times, and I have to say NRCS has been really great about providing those extensions. You know, I mean, 3 years, 3 years is a long time when you're a landowner or trying to make a deal happen. So we really try to, crack along and get that done before that deadline. But, in weird cases, somebody dies and it goes into an estate and things slow down and you just don't have power over the transaction timing anymore. NRCS has been, I think, really good. I don't think we've ever lost funding because, the clock ran out. So.
Okay. Anyone else?
If you don't mind, I'll offer. I'm wearing my land trust hat a little bit here. My transition to the conservation fund is only about 6 months old, so I'll put back on my Athens Land Trust hat. Athens Land Trust is the only certified eligible entity in Georgia. It was one of the first in the country, and with the new Farm Bill, they retained their certified eligible entity status. And I think that having that additional flexibility in terms of closing and being able to move a little bit more flexibly in the system can help address some of those challenges in terms of timeline. Now, if you're talking about holding a property during a buy, protect, sell, where you're starting an ASEP on day 1 and holding it until the end of the ASEP, ASEP ALE, that definitely will cause challenges for sure. But if you're talking, non-buy, protect, sell, I think it's a little more feasible. Alternatively, if you're an entity or an organization who is not the intended ALE easement holder and you're working with another organization, you don't have to kick off the ALE on day 1. You can delay the start of the application for the ALE funds further so that you could have a shorter closing window of the ALE support. A couple of thoughts.
Okay, let me ask another question, and then we want to do a poll, and then we can come back to questions. This is a question to you, John, specifically. What do you see as the impact of climate change policy at the federal level to potentially make new funding sources available for buy, protect, sell transactions? So do you see that the focus on climate change might be a way, I think probably you could answer it both in terms of additional funding for farmland protection generally, but buy, protect, sell specifically? You're on mute. John, you're on mute. Oh no, I think we can't. John, we can't hear you.
Yeah, he's trying. Yeah, he knows.
Now he knows.
All right, you hear me now?
Yep.
That was you, Beth, not me. Anyway, I think the whole discussion around climate, we are trying very intentionally of linking that back to protected farmland. And this is not something, and I advise everyone who's listening, it's part of this webinar, to have this be part of the banner you carry forward, because it really hasn't been stressed enough. Everyone's talking about regenerative agriculture, but putting carbon back into the soil doesn't do any good if it doesn't stay there. So we're trying to very specifically make that connection. Representative Pingree has a bill that I think will be see the light of day, and in this next session of Congress, that specifically links farmland protection and climate. So you also may have just heard that Biden is talking about protecting 30% of our country by the year 2030. And we're hoping that we can make the argument that a chunk of that is going to be farmland protection. So we really hope that the pressure to really do something meaningful on climate will indeed elevate funding for farmland protection. Without going too far afield, we also see challenges, right? Because climate is going to push us forward on an infrastructure track, including things like renewable energy production, which, if not done right, can be a major source of farmland development. So this is a really important thing for everyone on this call who gets that linkage to begin to talk about it more. And just to put a plug in, particularly on the idea of smart solar siting, go to AFT's website where we have considerable information on that you really want to bring to bear at the local level as well. But I do think there'll be more funding for farmland protection. But before that, remember the 2018 Farm Bill, I keep talking about ASEP, not ASEP-ALE, and the reason I do that is I'm still hoping that more of the overall ASEP funding will flow to ALE, which is the farmland portion of it. So I want to talk about the bigger picture. But remember that the 2018 Farm Bill provided an extra $2 billion, $200 million for each of the next 10 years for easements. Maybe 50% of that will flow to farmland work. That's significant. So will there be more money in the future? Possibly, probably. But I think right now the challenge is for NRCS to get working on spending that $2 billion.
Great, thank you. And I should say, speaking on that front, NRCS is planning to do a webinar on buy, protect, sell, and how it can be used through ASEP-ALE. Again, because the final rule that was oh so close to being published, change of administration, all unpublished rules were pulled back for the new administration. This is across the board. It wasn't anything specific to ASEP-ALE. We expect that rule to be published fairly soon, and then NRCS will be providing some additional guidance on some of the finer details about buy, protect, sell through ASIP AL. We have another question, but I want to launch this poll if we can, because through the National Agricultural Land Network, which again is a relatively new formal way that AFT is providing technical support and assistance to practitioners. We're trying to understand what are the best ways that we can help, particularly with so many of you who are interested in moving these kinds of projects forward. So if you would take a minute to sort of say of these things, or maybe you don't want to talk about buy, protect, sell anymore. We've done a couple webinars, you're set. But we do see different ways that we could be further engaging people and how things might be most helpful. So whether that's to, again, focus on, we tried to focus this time on the sort of transactional details, but we could think on the next webinar about how you work with the farmer buyer. That could be a specific focus, or whether you want more sort of intimate opportunities to be in to workshop ideas and particular questions you have about projects with some of you. So again, we're happy to think about it. If you have particular suggestions, we'd love you to put that in the question box, because we are all ears of the way that we can be most supportive in helping folks think through buy, protect, sell projects. So there we go. Okay, resources on the Farmland Information Center, that's the FIC, some interest in additional webinar, and not so much for the other two. So that's very useful. Please, again, feel free to put something in. I do have a last question for Maggie. The question was, why did the farmers in your in the project you talked about, why was it that the farmers sold the easement, not the land trust? I'm going to guess that that might have had something to do with funding sources, but that was the question.
Yeah, so they were, the eligible entity to be able to sell the easement. So I think that's a lot of why we're talking about this idea of us as a land trust being able to sell an easement as opposed to the farmers. But it worked in their case, and it's a model that we use. Yeah, so that was the reasoning for that.
Great. Okay. Well, I seem to have lost that little toolbar that shows me where the questions are. So I guess that's a sign that we are time and that we should finish up here. So to all of you panelists and to John, thank you ever so much for joining us. It has been really helpful to share your knowledge. I think for the couple of questions that didn't get answered, we will return to, we'll send a follow-up email to those of you who asked that question, because they were very detailed. But we appreciate all of your help here, and we will follow up with additional resources on the Farmland Information Center pages, including, for those of you who are willing, of you panelists, any additional sort of examples, or I know that Vermont Land Trust has already shared with us their request for proposals. We will put that up on the website. And if any of the rest of you have materials that you think would be particularly relevant, we'd love to post those as well. So again, my thanks to all of you. Thanks to all of you for listening in, and have a great rest of the day. Take care. Stay warm.
Bye.
Bye.